Welcome, everyone. This is our fun little study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management.
That's right.
And today we're digging into the readings from Section 05. That's the section on new public administration and administrative reforms.
Yeah, some really foundational stuff in there.
Absolutely. We're taking a deep dive today into the fascinating and often really challenging world of government reform.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're going to try and dissect the strategies, the sometimes surprising successes, and definitely the inevitable challenges that were faced by two really influential U.S. presidencies.
Clinton and Bush, right.
Exactly. And then we'll zoom out a bit, look at the broader picture, the sort of empirical evidence on something called new public management reforms, mostly looking at Europe for that part.
Okay, got it. So specific cases, then the bigger theory and evidence.
Precisely. Our mission today is basically to unpack three key sources. Each one gives us a pretty distinct lens on this really complex topic.
All right, what are we working with?
Okay, first up, we're leaning heavily on a report from the IBM Center for the Business of Government. It's titled Federal Government Reform: Lessons from Clinton's Reinventing Government and Bush's Management Agenda.
The IBM Center reports are usually pretty solid, very practical.
They are. This one offers a really rich, almost insider's view, you know? It draws on firsthand experience with both administrations' efforts. It even offers some, hard-won administrative advice for new presidents.
Oh, interesting, like a how-to guide based on past experience.
Sort of, yeah. Next, we'll broaden our perspective. We've got an article from the Public Management Review. The title is Did New Public Management Matter? An empirical analysis of the outsourcing and decentralization effects on public sector size. That's by Jose M. Alonso, Judith Clifton, and Daniel Díaz-Fuentes.
Okay, so that sounds like the data-driven piece, the empirical test.
Exactly. This study offers crucial and, honestly, as you'll hear, quite counterintuitive empirical data. It looks at whether these types of reforms actually did what they said they'd do, reduce public sector size.
Okay, looking forward to that one. The results might surprise us.
I think they will. And finally, we'll delve into an article from the Public Administration Review. This one's called Role of the Reinventing Government Movement in Federal Management Reform. It's by John M. Kamensky.
Kamensky. He was deeply involved in Clinton's efforts, wasn't he? The National Performance Review.
That's the one. So he gives us a really unique insider perspective on that whole era. So you see, together, these sources should give us a pretty comprehensive picture what drives reform, how it actually gets implemented, and maybe most importantly, what really counts as success in the end.
Sounds like a great plan. A mix of history, strategy, and empirical reality check.
Let's do it. Let's peel back the layers and get to the heart of what it means to truly reform how our government operates, and maybe understand why it's such an enduring challenge.
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it? As that IBM Center report highlights right at the start, government reform, it's not some modern invention.
Right. It feels like we hear about it constantly now, but it's old news.
It is. It's this recurring, almost cyclical theme in American governance. It stretches back well over a century. New presidents come in, they're full of ideas, full of promises.
And then they hit the reality of the bureaucracy.
Exactly. They quickly realize that the actual machinery of government itself needs serious attention if any of those big ideas are ever going to become reality.
That's such a critical point to start with. The IBM Center report really kicks off by noting that newly elected presidents, almost without fail, set out to reform the executive branch.
It's like item one on the agenda, almost.
Right. And it's not just a political talking point, something to say on the campaign trail. It seems like an almost unavoidable necessity because, well, frankly, the government is just this colossal, incredibly complex entity.
Steering an oil tanker, as they say.
Totally. Like trying to steer an oil tanker that's maybe been on autopilot for decades. We learned from the report that this tradition, this call for reform, goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt's Keep Commission. That was 1905.
Wow, 1905. And what were they trying to do back then?
Even then, the aim was to reduce red tape, a phrase we still use constantly today. The New York Times was reporting on it back in 1906, which just shows you how persistent this whole issue has been.
So the more things change,
the more they stay the same. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just ancient history. Organizations like the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, they consistently pinpoint managerial shortcomings, real problems that can absolutely derail major policy initiatives if they're not addressed.
Yeah, the GAO reports are often pretty sobering reading.
They are. And you only have to listen to current political discussions, right? You'll hear echoes of these historical calls for reform all the time, whether it's cutting the federal workforce or creating new public service academies or appointing chief management officers. It's just this perpetual challenge that seems to demand constant attention.
And that really brings us to the core challenge for us, trying to understand this topic, defining what reform actually means in practice. And, maybe even harder, how do we measure its impact? Did it actually work?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Historically, as the Kamensky article describes it, the typical approach to management reform often involved what we call blue ribbon commissions.
Ah, yes, the classic study panel.
Right. These were panels, usually of outside experts, brought in to study a specific problem and then recommend solutions. Sounds reasonable enough.
But there's always a but.
The problem was, often, the actual action on those recommendations was largely left to others. Implementation wasn't really built into the process. And so, many of these reports, full of good ideas, simply gathered dust on a shelf somewhere.
So good analysis, but poor follow-through.
Exactly. But as the IBM Center report really emphasizes, a significant shift began right around the Clinton administration. It moved away from that somewhat detached blue ribbon commission model.
Towards something more hands-on.
Much more hands-on.
Yeah.
Towards far more proactive White House-led initiatives that had a strong, sustained commitment to implementation built in from the start. That was a really fundamental change in philosophy. It wasn't just about diagnosing the problem anymore. It was about actually fixing it.
Okay, so no more just commissioning reports and, hoping for the best. These were active, White House-driven efforts. That must have made a huge difference.
It really did. And that evolution in thinking, it's highlighted by both the IBM Center report and that Public Management Review article we mentioned. The Reinventing Government movement, according to Kamensky, didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right, it had roots.
It sprang from, and I'm quoting him here, a decade of evolving management practices in the public and private sectors. This context is really crucial because it wasn't just about, say, cutting costs, although that was part of it. It was about truly modernizing how government worked, almost dragging it into the late 20th century, incorporating ideas that were already taking hold elsewhere.
Bringing government up to speed with the rest of the world, in a way.
In a way, yes. And it's really important here to place these specific U.S. reforms, Clinton's and Bush's, within that broader global context. The Alonso, Clifton, and Díaz-Fuentes study from the Public Management Review introduces us to this term, New Public Management, or NPM.
NPM. Okay, what's the big idea behind that?
Well, NPM is basically an umbrella term. It covers a whole wave of reforms that swept across many governments, not just the U.S., starting around the 1980s. The explicit aim was to incorporate private sector management ideas directly into public services.
Ah, the run government like a business idea.
That's often how it's framed, yes. Its proponents definitely had a clear agenda. They wanted to minimize and downsize government. Their core view was often that the public sector was inherently inefficient, maybe too large, too bureaucratic. They saw NPM as the antidote, the way to fix these perceived problems.
So what did that look like in practice? What kinds of policies fall under this NPM umbrella?
The study we're looking at actually details 10 major policy areas that synthesize the core NPM literature. We don't need to list all 10, maybe, but the key ideas definitely include things like introducing greater competition into the public sector.
Making government agencies compete.
Exactly. Making government services compete, perhaps with private providers. There's also a really strong emphasis on downsizing government workforces, adopting private sector management styles. And this is key, shifting from controlling inputs, like how much money goes into a program,
to measuring outputs, like what actually gets done.
Precisely. Controlling and measuring what comes out of it, the outputs or outcomes. There was also a big push for decentralization, breaking down those large monolithic bureaucracies into more agile, specialized agencies. Outsourcing many functions was huge.
Right, contracting out services.
Yes, separating the roles of purchaser and provider within government itself, focusing really strongly on customer orientation, thinking of citizens as customers, and separating the political decision-making from the day-to-day operational management.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive list of changes.
It is. So, if we connect the dots here, the reforms we're about to discuss under both Clinton and Bush can really be seen as major American expressions of these broader NPM principles. Even if they each had their own distinct flavor, their own unique focus, they were definitely drawing from that same well of ideas.
That gives us a fantastic framework. Okay, let's dive into President Clinton's administration first. When he launched his Reinventing Government Initiative, or NPR, as it became known, what was the big picture vision? What did he actually set out to do?
Well, when Clinton came into office in 1993, he was genuinely committed to this idea of fixing the government. He was, as the IBM report notes, deeply influenced by that 1992 bestseller, Reinventing Government by Osborne and Gabler.
Right, the book that sort of launched 1,000 ships in a way.
It really did. It offered this kind of blueprint for how to make government more entrepreneurial, more results-oriented. And Clinton's vision was clearly articulated right at the beginning in a White House announcement on March 3rd, 1993. It was pretty ambitious.
What did he say?
He declared, and I'll quote this from the IBM Center report because it captures it well,
Yeah.
"Our goal is to make the entire federal government less expensive and more efficient, and to change the culture of our national bureaucracy away from complacency and entitlement toward initiative and empowerment."
Wow. So less expensive, more efficient, and a culture change. That's aiming high.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about trimming the fat. It was about a fundamental cultural shift within the federal bureaucracy itself. And Kamensky, in his article, adds more detail. He explains that specific campaign promises, which were influenced by the Democratic Leadership Council, included cutting 100,000 federal employees, reducing the White House staff by 25%.
Ouch, starting at home.
Right. A promise that, as we'll hear later, actually came with its own set of challenges, and also decreasing overall agency administrative expenses. It was truly meant to be a comprehensive agenda for change, touching almost every aspect of government operations.
That's a massive undertaking. Who did he actually put in charge of translating that kind of grand vision into concrete action across the entire federal government? That sounds like a Herculean task.
It really was. And he gave that formidable task to Vice President Al Gore.
Okay, Gore was the point person.
He was. And interestingly, he was given a rather tight 6-month deadline to come back with recommendations.
6 months for the whole federal government.
6 months. So he immediately formed a task force, initially called the National Performance Review, or NPR. The central team was about 250 staff, which sounds like a lot, but for the whole government.
It's actually pretty lean.
It is. But crucially, it was augmented by agency-level teams that were spread throughout the government, working within the departments. Elaine Kamarck, who was Gore's senior policy advisor, oversaw the entire effort. And a seasoned reformer named Bob Stone, who had a really strong track record from the Defense Department, actually led the cadre of staff doing the day-to-day work.
So experienced leadership.
Definitely. And what's fascinating, I think, is that the NPR drew some of its senior staff directly from the highly successful Texas Performance Review team.
Borrowing a model that worked elsewhere.
Exactly. It indicated a clear readiness to adopt proven methods rather than trying to reinvent the wheel entirely. It showed a very practical, results-oriented approach right from the very beginning of the initiative.
Okay, so they had the vision, the leadership, the structure. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. How did they actually manage to figure out what to recommend across such a massive, complex government? And within that crazy, tight 6-month window, it still sounds almost impossible.
It truly was a monumental effort, and they used a combination of approaches. It was both top-down and bottom-up. Teams were formed specifically to conduct these in-depth reviews of agencies and also core administrative systems, things like human resources, budget, procurement, finance.
The nuts and bolts.
The real nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
But what really made it unique, I think, and gave it real political weight was Vice President Gore's personal engagement. He didn't just delegate this.
He was hands-on.
Very hands-on. He directly engaged the public and, maybe even more crucially, the federal workforce itself. He received something like over 50,000 letters from citizens and employees offering ideas, and he held numerous listening sessions all around the country.
So really trying to tap into that frontline knowledge.
Absolutely. And this personal outreach was key, not just for gathering ideas, although that was important, but also for shaping his own views on what the final recommendations should be. And perhaps most importantly, it fostered a really strong personal commitment from him to actually follow through on implementing whatever they came up with.
Okay, so it wasn't just an academic exercise for him. It became deeply personal. And what was the culmination of all that engagement, all that review? What did they produce at the end of those 6 months?
The core document that emerged from all this intense effort was released in September 1993. It was titled From Red Tape to Results: Creating a Government That Works Better and Costs Less.
Catchy title. Works better and costs less.
It is. And it was a hefty report. It contained over 1,200 specific recommendations, distilled down from nearly 2,000 pages of detailed team reports.
1,200 recommendations.
Yeah. And Kamensky, in his article, highlights the inherent tension right there in that title. Works better and costs less. One set of recommendations really focused on the working better part, things like streamlining those cumbersome procurement processes, establishing clear customer service standards for agencies.
Making government easier to deal with.
Exactly. But then another set focused squarely on the costing less part. And these included some really ambitious goals, like cutting 250,000 federal employee positions, eliminating hundreds of programs deemed obsolete, and aiming for over $100 billion in savings over 5 years.
Big numbers.
Huge numbers. And President Clinton's commitment at the launch of the implementation phase, it was absolutely unequivocal. He famously stated, and this quote really resonates, it's in the IBM report, there are a lot of places in this report where it says, the president should, the president should, the president should. Well, let me tell you something. I've read it, and where it says the president should, the president will.
Wow. That's laying down the law. No ambiguity there.
None at all. It was a powerful declaration, signaling really serious intent and undeniable top-level support.
Okay, that's a powerful statement. Really setting a clear expectation, putting the presidency's full weight behind it. But, as you said, this wasn't just about producing a report. It was meant to be an ongoing process. How did the NPR actually get things done? How did they maintain that momentum over Clinton's entire 8 years in office? It's one thing to announce it, another to make it happen year after year.
Right. And Gore provided some early guidance that proved really crucial for that longevity. He told the team to focus on actionable recommendations, things that could preferably be achieved through executive branch action, rather than relying solely on Congress.
Smart move, politically.
Very smart. And fundamentally, he said, focus on fixing what's inside the boxes, meaning improving how agencies actually operate, rather than just reshuffling organizational charts, which often look like change but doesn't achieve much.
Change the process, not just the org chart.
Exactly. The IBM Center report identifies 3 main strategies that the NPR used, and interestingly, these actually evolved over time as they learned what worked and what didn't.
Okay, what was the first strategy?
The first strategy was the most visible, maybe the most traditional, acting on the formal recommendations. Those 1,200 recommendations were meticulously categorized by what they required. Was it new legislation? Was it direct presidential action, like an executive order? Or was it something an agency could just do on its own?
So sorting them by implementation path.
Right. And the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, played a key role here in drafting the necessary executive orders and legislation. Ultimately, over 90 pieces of legislation related to NPR recommendations were eventually adopted by Congress.
That's actually quite a lot of legislation for management reform.
It is, especially compared to other eras. It included significant things like procurement reforms. The Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994 was a big one. It truly streamlined how the government bought goods and services and made a real, tangible difference.
Okay, so that was a formal structural approach, following the recommendations. What about the other ways they tried to drive change? You said there were 3 strategies.
The second strategy was incredibly fascinating, I think, and much more grassroots. They called it the Reinvention campaign. It was often described with the phrase, letting 1,000 flowers bloom.
Okay, sounds very bottom-up.
It was absolutely intended to be. This is a deliberate effort to change the bureaucratic culture from the bottom up, reaching far beyond just those formal recommendations. It was built around 4 core principles, sort of mantras for the campaign. Put customers first, cut red tape, empower employees to get results, and cut back to basics.
Simple, clear messages.
Very. And the NPR team actively sponsored things called Reinvention Labs. These were basically self-directed teams of federal employees who were given permission to pilot innovations in their own work areas to try new things.
Letting people experiment.
Exactly. They also created the Hammer Awards, which was a rather clever bit of branding.
The Hammer Awards, what were they for?
They were literally hammers, spray-painted gold, mounted on a plaque, symbolizing breaking down bureaucracy. They recognized nearly 1,400 teams involving over 60,000 employees for applying these reinvention principles in their work. There was even a reinvention video made to help spread the message internally.
So really trying to build enthusiasm and buy-in from the workforce itself?
Absolutely. This bottom-up approach, sometimes even playfully called a guerrilla campaign by those involved, often made the traditional bureaucracy, the central management agencies, a bit nervous.
I can imagine. Disrupting the status quo.
Right. But it strongly inspired Gore and the NPR staff to push forward. They actively sought waivers of restrictive agency rules and widely promoted any best practices they found bubbling up from these labs. It was really about trying to unleash the creativity and initiative of individual federal employees, people who knew where the problems were.
That sounds like a significant attempt at genuine cultural transformation, getting buy-in from the ground up, not just imposing rules from the top. What was the third strategy then, as the initiative matured over the years?
As Clinton's first term ended and he moved into his second, the NPR's role shifted again. The third strategy involved engaging bureau-level agencies much more directly and strategically, and the initiative itself was actually renamed the National Partnership for Reinventing Government.
Okay, signaling a shift to partnership.
Exactly. The focus moved to supporting about 30 specific bureau-level agencies, particularly those that had high levels of public interaction agencies you might deal with directly. They helped them deliver specific, citizen-facing initiatives.
Like what kind of initiatives? Give us some examples.
Think about tangible improvements for you, the citizen. Things like increasing tornado warning times from the National Weather Service, providing 24/7 phone service at the IRS, allowing students to apply for loans online, or significantly cutting the review cycles for new drug approvals at the FDA, getting potentially life-saving medications to market faster.
Okay, so really concrete, measurable improvements in service delivery.
That was the focus. And they also continue to influence the broader culture change by doing things like modifying the performance rating standards for senior executives, making them much more results-oriented. They sponsored customer satisfaction surveys and employee surveys to track progress. They even used internal traffic light scorecards, red, yellow, green, to track progress within agencies on their reinvention goals.
Borrowing a page from the future Bush playbook, maybe?
Perhaps. Or maybe Bush borrowed from them. But beyond these three sort of structured strategies, the NPR also proved incredibly adaptable. It served as a kind of fast-acting, flexible unit for a whole series of opportunistic initiatives that came up.
Like a rapid response team for reform.
Kind of. They would convene cross-agency efforts on emerging issues that the president or vice president care about, things like improving child health insurance enrollment, coordinating efforts for safer cities, thinking about the 21st century workforce needs, and even pushing the plain language initiative to make government documents actually understandable to normal people.
That's a worthy goal in itself.
Isn't it? This adaptability was really key to keeping the NPR relevant and responsive to the president and vice president's evolving priorities over 8 full years.
Okay, so after all that comprehensive effort, the formal recommendations, the grassroots campaign, the targeted agency support, the opportunistic initiatives over 8 years, did it actually work? What were the big wins? And what kind of legacy did it leave behind after Clinton left office? Did it stick?
That's the critical question. And the NPR itself certainly claimed quite significant achievements on both the costs less and the works better fronts, as the IBM Center report details.
Okay, let's hear the claims. What do they say on costs less?
On the cost less side, they proudly announced a federal workforce reduction of 426,200 employees.
Wow, nearly 500,000 positions.
It's a huge number. Plus, the passage of those 90 pieces of related legislation, the elimination of 250 programs they deemed obsolete, and a massive reduction in paperwork, 640,000 pages of internal agency regulations and 16,000 pages of public regulations eliminated.
That sounds like a serious attack on red tape.
It does. And they even claimed over $136 billion in savings over 5 years.
Those are staggering numbers, but I seem to recall there was some debate around those savings figures, right? Were they entirely solid?
That's a really crucial point to bring up. While the intent was certainly there to reduce costs, and some savings undoubtedly occurred, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, later took a hard look. They noted that the relationship between the specific NPR recommendations and the claimed dollar savings was, in their words, not at all clear.
Not at all clear. That sounds like cautious auditor speak for we couldn't verify it.
Pretty much. The GAO suggested there might have been a political need to claim substantial cost savings that sometimes overshadowed rigorous analytical proof. So while the general sense of government-wide savings was likely achieved, that precise $136 billion figure remains somewhat debatable, perhaps inflated for political purposes.
Okay, that's a good distinction to make, the political messaging versus the verifiable impact. What about the works better claims? Were those more concrete?
On the works better front, the claims were still quite impressive and perhaps more directly attributable to the NPR's efforts. For instance, citizen trust in the federal government reportedly more than doubled during the Clinton administration.
Doubled. From what to what?
It jumped from a low of 21% when he took office to 44% later in his term, according to some polls cited in the report. Now, correlation isn't causation, but it's suggestive.
Still, a significant jump.
Definitely. Also, employee satisfaction in agencies where these reinvention principles truly took hold was reportedly twice as high, an 84% satisfaction rate, compared to just 42% in places where reinvention wasn't really a priority.
That suggests the culture change efforts had a real impact on morale.
It does. And customer satisfaction with federal services actually improved to levels comparable with the private sector, according to those well-regarded surveys from the University of Michigan's American Customer Satisfaction Index.
Okay, so maybe the works better side has more tangible evidence behind it. But beyond the specific metrics, what about the lasting impact? Did any of these changes stick around? Did they leave an enduring legacy?
Absolutely, and this is maybe the most important part. Beyond the specific metrics or savings debates, the NPR left an incredibly enduring legacy of institutional changes, many of which persist today, irrespective of who's in the White House.
Like what? What structures or practices lasted?
For instance, the designation of chief operating officers, COOs, within agencies responsible for day-to-day operations became a highly successful and continued approach. It was adopted and strengthened by the Bush administration and is standard practice now.
So professionalizing the management function.
Exactly. The President's Management Council, PMC, which the NPR established to coordinate government-wide implementation, still exists today. It continues to lead cross-agency management efforts.
Okay. Another lasting structure.
Right. Those annual employee surveys that NPR started, they were continued administratively by Bush and later actually incorporated into law in 2003. They provide vital benchmarks for tracking employee morale and engagement year after year.
Data collection that became permanent.
Yep. The senior executive performance standards were updated by NPR to be much more results-oriented. Bush then extended this to link executive pay directly to performance, and these results-oriented standards were also eventually incorporated into law.
Making performance matter for senior leaders.
Precisely. And finally, that government-wide web portal they launched, initially called FirstGov, and now known as USA.gov. It became a top 25 website globally, recognized for innovation, and it provides a central point of access to government information and services for you, the citizen.
I use USA.gov all the time. Didn't realize it came from that era.
Many of these foundational pieces did.
Okay, so Clinton, with Vice President Gore leading the charge, launched this very expansive, often grassroots reinvention effort. It was focused on culture change, broad improvements, maybe less on rigid measurement sometimes. Now, let's pivot. Let's turn our attention to President George W. Bush. He was often called the MBA president, right? What kind of blueprint did he bring to the table for government reform with his management agenda? Was it a continuation of NPR, or was it a radical departure?
It was definitely a very distinct approach, certainly a departure in style and structure, though interestingly, it ended up addressing many of the same underlying management issues that Clinton tackled.
So different methods, same problems.
To a large extent, yes. Bush made management and performance a core plank of his campaign, right from the start. And unlike some presidents who maybe let reform efforts languish after the election, he acted on it very early in his administration. He made it crystal clear that improving government operations was a top priority for him, not some kind of afterthought.
Setting the tone from the top?
Absolutely. And as the IBM Center report details, his reform efforts, which became known as the President's Management Agenda, or PMA, were run very differently. They were managed directly out of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, specifically by the Deputy Director for Management, who reported directly to the President on progress.
Okay, so centralized in OMB with a direct line to the Oval Office. That's different from Gore's separate task force.
Very different. This centralized, top-down approach maintained an incredibly consistent focus on a very targeted agenda over his entire 8 years in office. His very first budget plan, called A Blueprint for New Beginnings, released in February 2001, laid out his governing philosophy. He called for an active but limited government.
A classic conservative principle.
Right. A government that empowers states, cities, and citizens to make decisions, ensures results through accountability, and promotes innovation through competition. And the core principle that really became the administration's standard, the mantra you heard again and again, and a clear signal about his focus was this: what matters in the end is performance. Not just making promises, but making good on promises.
Performance, results, accountability. Sounds very businesslike.
It was explicitly intended to be. It was about tangible results and holding agencies accountable for delivering them.
Okay, that sounds incredibly disciplined, almost like rolling out a corporate strategy. How did they manage to narrow down that vast universe of potential government management problems into such a manageable, focused agenda? Especially when you compare it to Clinton's 1,200 plus recommendations, that seems like a key difference right there.
It really was a key difference, and that's where the discipline you mentioned came in. OMB Director Mitch Daniels spearheaded the effort to actually craft the details of the PMA. It wasn't a rushed process. It was very deliberate, very expert-driven.
Who did they consult?
They gathered input from senior OMB career staff, from the inspectors general across the government, from the GAO's long-standing high-risk list, that list of areas most vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse, and also from external experts, like the National Academy of Public Administration.
So leveraging existing knowledge and expertise.
Exactly. And in July 2001, Bush very wisely reestablished the President's Management Council, that group of agency COOs that Clinton had started. He saw it as a crucial integrating mechanism for implementing the PMA. This helped foster a sense of shared community and purpose among the agency leaders right from the get-go.
Getting the top managers on board early.
Crucial. But perhaps the most insightful move, in my opinion, was that instead of creating another long laundry list of recommendations, Bush focused the PMA on just 5 chronic core management problems.
Just 5 out of everything they could have chosen.
Just 5.
Yeah.
And these weren't chosen arbitrarily. They were selected very carefully because they were seen as the most apparent deficiencies, where the opportunity to improve performance is the greatest. They went for the biggest, most persistent challenges.
Okay, so what were those crucial 5? The core of the PMA.
All right, the 5 elements of the President's management agenda were
Strategic management of human capital. Basically, how to recruit, train, manage, and retain top talent in government.
the people problem, always key.
Always. Number 2, competitive sourcing. This was the policy of allowing public sector units and private sector companies to compete for the right to provide certain government services.
The controversial competition element.
Definitely controversial. Number 3, improvement of financial performance. Really getting the government's books in order, achieving clean financial audits.
Basic financial hygiene, but hard to do in government.
Very hard. Number 4, expansion of e-government. Using technology more effectively to deliver services to citizens and improve internal operations.
Building on what Clinton started there.
Yes, continuing and expanding that work. And number 5, budget and performance integration. This was about explicitly linking how much money an agency or program got to how well it was actually performing, making the budget reflect results.
Connecting the dollars to the outcomes.
Exactly. And crucially, each one of these 5 elements had about 8 to 10 specific standards of success defined under it. This made them measurable, trackable. You knew what good looked like for each one.
So clear goals, measurable standards.
Right. And the rollout was managed very carefully. Bush himself addressed the entire senior executive service, the top career managers, in October 2001 to lay out the PMA. They conducted workshops for all incoming political appointees, and they assigned clear owners within OMB and the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, for each initiative. All of this signaled incredibly strong, top-level commitment and established very clear lines of responsibility.
That is a stark contrast to Clinton's broader, more campaign-like approach. But having a clear agenda is one thing. Ensuring that all the different agencies actually followed through on those 5 priorities, that's the hard part, isn't it? What tools did they use to drive that accountability, especially with that phrase you used earlier, relentless follow-up?
Right, the follow-up was key. The administration deployed some powerful and at times you could say quite aggressive tools, all emphasizing that relentless follow-up by OMB. The most visible and probably most famous was the drafting light scorecard.
The red, yellow, green system.
Exactly. It was a simple yet incredibly effective red, yellow, or green grading system. It tracked both the current status and the progress being made by each major department and agency against those government-wide standards for each of the 5 PMA initiatives.
How often do they update these scores?
OMB program examiners meticulously reassessed these scores every single quarter, every 90 days, and the results were made public. The president himself reportedly discussed these scores directly with his cabinet members.
Oh, I bet that focused some attention. Nobody wants a red light from the president.
You can imagine. It apparently created a powerful incentive, a real competition for bragging rights, or at least to avoid being at the bottom of the list. OMB's Clay Johnson, who was the driving force behind the PMA's implementation.
The deputy director for management you mentioned.
That's him. He reportedly used the public release of these scores quite deliberately to goad agencies into action. He even frankly referred to the strategy sometimes as using shame and humiliation.
Wow, shame and humiliation. That's pretty blunt language for government management.
It certainly is. It indicates a very high-stakes environment, and it likely motivated some rapid changes. Just to give you an idea, when the PMA was first launched in 2001, a staggering 110 out of the initial 130 agency scores were red.
So basically, almost everyone started in the failing category.
Pretty much. It showed significant room for improvement across virtually the entire government and set a clear baseline for progress.
Okay, the scorecard was clearly a powerful driver. What other tools did they use, particularly to make that link between performance and budget decisions more concrete?
Right. Besides the scorecard, they developed another really innovative and, again, very disciplined tool called the Program Assessment Rating Tool, or PART.
Part. Okay, what did that do?
PART was designed to explicitly link performance information directly with budget decisions, but at a much more granular, program-specific funding level. It wasn't just about the agency overall, it was about individual programs.
How did it work?
It consisted of a detailed questionnaire, about 25 basic questions, plus some tailored ones for different types of programs, like regulatory programs versus grant programs. These questions covered 4 core sections: a program's fundamental purpose and design, its strategic planning, its day-to-day management, and, most critically, its actual results and accountability.
So a deep dive into each program's effectiveness.
A very deep dive. The answers resulted in numerical scores, from 0 to 100, which were then translated into straightforward qualitative ratings: effective, moderately effective, adequate, ineffective, or, if the data just wasn't there, results not demonstrated.
These part scores actually influenced budgets.
They did. Through February 2008, PART assessed over 1,000 different federal programs, representing a remarkable 98% of the entire federal budget. Now, these ratings didn't automatically dictate funding levels. Congress still controlled the purse strings, but they absolutely influenced budget proposals and decisions. An ineffective rating was a very clear signal that a program just wasn't working as intended and needed serious reconsideration, potentially funding cuts or termination. And it significantly increased transparency about program performance.
So the scorecard for the agency, part for the programs. Any other tools in the PMA toolkit?
Yes, a couple more worth mentioning. Clay Johnson also introduced something called Proud to Be memos. He asked the OMB initiative owners for each of the 5 PMA areas to work directly with their agency counterparts. Their task was to develop specific, ambitious targets for where they would be proud to be by a certain date. This was designed to foster a strong sense of internal ownership and commitment within the agencies, not just compliance.
Getting agencies to set their own ambitious goals.
Exactly. And finally, to promote transparency and accountability directly to the public, they launched 2 key public transparency portals. First was results.gov, launched in late 2002. This served as a web portal specifically for the PMA and related management issues. It was open to career employees and the public, allowing anyone to track progress on the agenda.
Making the scorecard results public online.
Yes. And then later, in 2006, they launched expectmore.gov. This site went even further. It posted all the detailed part questions, the answers provided by the agencies, the supporting evidence they submitted, and the final part scores, all in a readable, searchable format. It provided a genuine citizen's window into agency program effectiveness.
That's impressive transparency.
It really was. These tools, the scorecard, part, the memos, the websites, collectively created a very structured, very public-facing, and ultimately very powerful accountability framework for driving the management agenda.
Okay, so we have this highly structured, top-down approach driven by OMB, emphasizing relentless follow-up using public scorecards and program ratings. Did it actually deliver on its promises? What were the tangible accomplishments of the Bush management agenda according to the IBM report? Did the discipline pay off?
Absolutely. The IBM Center report definitely credits the Bush administration with making important progress in improving the fundamental management capacity of federal agencies. The discipline did seem to pay off in measurable ways.
Okay, give us some highlights. Where did they see the biggest gains?
Well, on the financial front, remember that goal of improving financial performance. The time required for agencies to prepare their audited financial statements accelerated dramatically. It went from taking about 6 months after the fiscal year ended down to a remarkable 6 weeks.
That's a huge improvement in timeliness.
Huge! And by 2007, 19 out of the 24 major federal agencies received clean audit opinions, meaning their books were basically in good order. That was a significant improvement, demonstrating much better financial management across the board.
Okay, better bookkeeping. What else?
They also made really significant strides in performance budget integration. Agencies substantially restructured their budget justifications that they sent to Congress. They now had to explicitly include detailed past and projected performance information, making that link between spending and results much clearer than it had ever been before.
So PART was having a real effect on budget documents.
It seems so, and the comprehensive program assessments through PART themselves were an accomplishment. Assessing nearly the entire federal budget, concluding that roughly 80% of federal programs were achieving their intended goals that dramatically increased transparency and just provided a much clearer picture of overall government effectiveness, warts and all.
That's a strong track record for a more centralized, data-driven approach. What about in areas like using technology or streamlining government services?
Yeah, good progress there too. For e-government services and shared lines of business, the administration identified and pushed forward 24 high-impact e-government initiatives. These included things you probably use, like electronic tax filing, but also efforts to simplify the complex online rulemaking processes and creating more centralized portals for specific services.
Building common platforms instead of reinventing the wheel.
Exactly. They formed these line of business task forces, eventually expanding to 9 of them, specifically to develop common administrative solutions and reduce what we often call stovepiped operations. That's where every single agency tries to solve the same basic problem independently, like managing grants or processing payroll.
So finding efficiencies through standardization.
Right. For instance, the e-rulemaking initiative successfully replaced something like 20 different individual agency systems with one common government-wide system. That saved significant resources and improved efficiency for agencies and the public. There was also a notable reduction in improper payments, things like overpayments or payments to the wrong person. They saw a 17% decrease across 30 major programs just in fiscal year 2004, which indicated better stewardship of taxpayer money.
Okay, those sound like solid, measurable management improvements. Now, what about that more controversial area you mentioned? Competitive sourcing. How did that play out?
Well, the administration definitely pushed competitive sourcing, also known sometimes as public-private competition, very aggressively. By fiscal year 2006, they had conducted 12,243 competitions involving over 46,000 federal employee positions.
That's a lot of competition.
It is. And while this was definitely controversial, facing strong opposition from employee unions and some in Congress, these competitions were estimated by OMB to save taxpayers about $6.9 billion over time.
But who actually won these competitions? Did the private sector take over a lot of government work?
That's what's particularly interesting and maybe counterintuitive to some assumptions. Government employees, organized into teams to bid for their own work, actually won nearly 90% of these competitions.
90%. So the federal workers kept the jobs most of the time.
Overwhelmingly. Often by demonstrating they could achieve greater efficiency or innovation when directly challenged by the prospect of outsourcing. So the competition itself seemed to drive internal improvement.
Fascinating. Any other major accomplishments under the PMA?
One more big area was performance pay initiatives. They established new pay-for-performance systems, first for the Senior Executive Service in August 2004, and later these were extended to cover nearly 300,000 federal employees in large agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. This aimed to directly link employee pay raises to their individual performance ratings, a hallmark of private sector management practices.
Trying to incentivize high performers.
That was the goal. And just like Clinton's team tried to institutionalize their changes, the Bush administration also worked hard to make the PMA stick. They issued Executive Order 13450 late in the term in 2007, which mandated that agencies appoint performance improvement officers and established a government-wide performance improvement council, all designed to ensure continuity into future administrations.
So building structures to keep the focus on performance.
Exactly. So the big takeaway for you, the listener, from the Bush era is really how it demonstrated the power of consistent, dedicated, and data-driven leadership in implementing systemic change. It showed how a clear, focused, and persistently managed top-down approach, combined with transparency tools like scorecards and PART, could drive significant, measurable changes in government operations, even if some elements were controversial.
Okay, we've now explored two incredibly ambitious but, as you've highlighted, very different reform efforts. Clinton's expansive, more bottom-up reinventing government, and Bush's disciplined, top-down management agenda. Before we zoom out again and draw some larger lessons for future reformers, let's just put them side by side for a moment. What did these two administrations, coming from different political parties, actually have in common when it came to reform? And where do they really diverge in their fundamental approaches?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating comparison, isn't it? And the IBM Center report offers a really insightful analysis here, noting both some surprising similarities and also some really striking differences. Let's start with the key similarities.
Okay, where do they overlap?
Well, first and foremost, both presidents showed incredibly strong top-level commitment. Clinton, with Vice President Gore personally leading the NPR day in and day out, and President Bush directly championing the PMA and holding cabinet secretaries accountable, both ensured their initiatives had that crucial presidential seal of approval and sustained attention. That's vital.
Absolutely. Without the boss backing it, it probably goes nowhere.
Exactly. Both initiatives also had surprisingly similar emphasis on citizen and customer focus and a greater use of electronic government. Clinton introduced those customer service standards and satisfaction surveys. Bush drove initiatives like electronic tax filing and really pushed the implementation of the Government Paperwork Elimination Act, which ultimately led to things like USA.gov.
That makes sense. Regardless of political party, making government more responsive and accessible to citizens seems like a pretty universal goal, doesn't it?
It really does. What else did they share? Well, they both also displayed similar shifts in implementation strategy over time. This is interesting. Both administrations started with somewhat more top-down approaches initially, NPR setting broad goals, PMA defining the 5 priorities. But then both evolved towards a more supportive role later in their terms, working with agency leaders more collaboratively to develop shared initiatives and targets.
So they both learned to be more collaborative as they went along.
It seems that way. This adaptive approach, moving from being purely directive to more collaborative, ultimately seemed to foster greater ownership and buy-in at the agency level, which is absolutely crucial if you want reforms to actually stick long term. Both administrations also tackled common management challenges that just seem perennial in government. Things like improving financial management, strengthening human capital, integrating budget and performance. It's interesting how efforts begun under Clinton, like improving financial audits, often saw more concrete, institutionalized implementation under Bush, building on that earlier work.
So a kind of continuity on the core problems, even with different approaches.
Right. However, both also found it incredibly difficult to successfully engage Congress on broad management initiatives. This led to surprisingly few major pieces of legislation focused purely on management reform passing under either president. Most legislative changes ended up being much more targeted, like Clinton's procurement reforms or Bush's changes to defense personnel systems, often tucked into other bills.
Why do you think Congress wasn't that interested? Management isn't very glamorous.
That's likely a big part of it. Management reform doesn't usually generate exciting headlines or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It's often seen as technical, inside baseball. And finally, another similarity. Both administrations struggled with public recognition challenges. Despite these massive undertakings involving huge amounts of effort and resources, both found it really difficult to effectively communicate the results and the value of their management improvement efforts to the general public. This meant these significant reforms often just flew completely under the radar of average citizens.
So similar goals in many ways, tackling similar underlying problems, and even running into similar roadblocks from Congress and facing challenges with public perception, despite coming from different political stripes. That's fascinating in itself. But where did their approaches really differ? Where did their core philosophies of how to manage the government truly diverge?
Okay, the differences are just as revealing, maybe more so. Their difference in scope was probably the most stark. Clinton's NPR, remember, generated over 1,200 recommendations. It was incredibly broad, leading some critics at the time to call its breadth almost naive or simply too unfocused to manage effectively. It was this ever-evolving, continuously generated stream of new initiatives throughout his 8 years.
Trying to boil the ocean, maybe?
Some argued that. Bush's PMA, in sharp contrast, focused intensely, almost relentlessly, on just those 5 core, well-known management challenges. They implemented them with a dogged, almost unwavering consistency over his entire administration, adding or deleting relatively few items from that core agenda. This was clearly about depth and sustained focus over breadth, a very different philosophy of change.
Okay, scope was one big difference. What else?
Their implementation strategies also diverged significantly. Remember how NPR often tried to bypass the central control agencies like OMB and the Office of Personnel Management, OPM?
Yeah, they saw them as part of the problem, right? Too bureaucratic.
Exactly. They viewed them as being too stuck in past command and control approaches and tried to work around them. Bush, conversely, leaned heavily on these very agencies, particularly OMB, for implementation and for driving that relentless follow-up with the scorecards and part reviews. This reflected a fundamentally different philosophy on how best to drive change within the existing bureaucratic structure, work around it, or work through it.
That's a fundamental strategic choice right there. And what about how they approached the people within the government, the federal workforce itself? Did they differ there?
They did, significantly. In terms of staffing the reform effort itself, NPR formed its own dedicated but largely temporary team and relied heavily on those agency-based teams with a very high rotation of staff coming in and out over the years. Something like 1,400 staff rotated through the core NPR team over 8 years.
Wow, lots of churn.
Lots of churn, bringing fresh perspectives but maybe less continuity. Bush, on the other hand, relied heavily on OMB's permanent career staff and the permanent staff within the agencies to implement the PMA, clearly aiming for continuity and building institutional memory within the existing structures.
Okay, staffing differed. What about how they engaged employees?
Their engagement strategies also varied quite a bit. NPR, with its 1,000 Flowers Bloom approach, directly engaged frontline employees through things like the Hemmer Awards and the Reinvention Labs, really trying to foster a grassroots movement of innovation from the bottom up. Bush, reflecting his more top-down approach, systematically engaged agency political leaders through a very clear chain of command structure. He personally briefed all new political appointees on the PMA and expected strict adherence down the line.
So bottom-up versus top-down engagement. Makes sense.
Right. And finally, their methods for recognition for progress were quite different, reflecting these philosophies. NPR focused on celebrating individual cases of success with those Hammer Awards. Given to nearly 1,400 teams, it was a celebration of grassroots innovation. Bush, as we heard, relied much more on the shame and humiliation, as Clay Johnson put it, of those publicly released quarterly traffic light scorecards, openly comparing agencies' progress against each other. Very different motivational tactics.
Positive reinforcement versus public pressure.
Exactly. And one last key difference, their labor management approaches. NPR made a point of extensively engaging the federal employee unions through things like partnership councils, seeking collaboration on reforms. Bush, in contrast, curtailed the union's formal roles in some management areas and focused much more on exposing government services to competition with the private sector through that aggressive competitive sourcing initiative. Both administrations actually used public-private competition to some extent, but it definitely became much more central and politically charged under Bush, reflecting these contrasting philosophies of governance and change management.
This comparative history is just invaluable. It really shows us the nuances of these major reform efforts. It highlights that even when you have good intentions, the how of reform, the strategy, the structure, the tone, profoundly shapes its outcome and its legacy.
Absolutely. The process really matters.
But now, let's connect this back to that third reading, the Alonso, Clifton, and Díaz-Fuentes study from the Public Management Review. It takes a different, and I think incredibly crucial, angle. It asks a fundamental question that goes beyond these individual presidential efforts. Did these broad NPM-style reforms, the kind both Clinton and Bush were implementing in their own ways, did they actually lead to a smaller public sector, as their proponents consistently claim they would? This moves us beyond the specific initiatives in the U.S. to the broader empirical impact of the underlying philosophy, looking at the European experience.
And this is such an important question to ask because, as we discussed, NPM often boasted about improving measurement and accountability in government, yet perhaps surprisingly, rigorous empirical evaluations of its actual impact on overall public sector size are actually quite scarce.
Really? Despite all the talk about shrinking government?
It's true. There's often this significant gap between the rhetoric, the promises of efficiency, cost savings, and downsizing, and the hard evidence. And understanding this gap is really critical for you, the listener, because the ongoing global financial crises and the renewed waves of austerity we've seen make understanding the real measurable effects of policies like outsourcing and decentralization even more vital. These are still very popular tools that governments reach for today when facing budget pressures. We really need to know if they actually deliver on their stated goals of shrinking the state.
So how did the researchers in that Public Management Review article actually go about answering this? It sounds like a tough thing to measure across multiple countries and decades. What was their methodology to try and get to the truth of this complex claim?
They use a pretty robust approach. They compiled an unbalanced panel data set, which basically means they had data for different countries over different time periods, but not necessarily complete data for every country every single year. This covered 15 European Union countries, giving them a good breadth, and spanned a long period from 1983 all the way up to 2011.
Okay, a wide lens across time and space. What specific NPM policies did they focus on?
They specifically focused on two major policies commonly associated with NPM that they could reliably quantify across these countries. The first was government outsourcing. They measured this as the sum of intermediate consumption plus social transfers in kind provided through market producers, all taken as a share of final government consumption. It's a bit technical.
But basically, it's a measure of how much government was spending on buying services from external providers.
Right. Exactly, but it's a good way to think about it. The second policy was administrative decentralization. Here, they used two different indicators to capture different aspects of it. First, expenditure decentralization, which is simply the share of total public spending that happens at the subnational level, state or local government, compared to the consolidated national total.
How much spending is pushed down?
Right. And second, they looked at subnational government autonomy. This was measured by the percentage of total subnational government revenues that did not come from transfers from the central government. This indicates how much financial independence those lower levels of government actually had. Could they raise their own money?
Okay, so outsourcing and decentralization measured quantitatively. Then what did they compare these against?
They then looked at how these two policies, outsourcing and decentralization, affected the overall public sector size. And they measured that in two key ways as well. First, by total government expenditure as a share of GDP. And second, by total government employment as a share of the country's working age population.
So looking at both the financial size and the personnel size of government.
Precisely. And based on this framework, they developed two main hypotheses they wanted to test. First, the standard NPM claim that outsourcing policies would lead to a reduction in public sector size, either expenditure or employment. Or the alternative hypothesis that outsourcing would not necessarily lead to a reduction.
Okay, test the conventional wisdom. What was the second hypothesis?
Second, they tested whether a greater degree of decentralization would lead to a reduced public sector size. The idea being that local governments might be more efficient or responsive to taxpayer pressure. Or the alternative, that decentralization might actually lead to a larger public sector, perhaps due to duplication or loss of economies of scale. It was a really comprehensive framework designed to directly test these core, often unexamined claims of new public management using real-world data.
Okay, so they built this comprehensive framework, gathered data across 15 countries over almost 30 years, and ran the analysis to test these core NPM claims. What were their key findings? This feels like where we get to the real moment, the empirical punchline from this extensive analysis. What did they actually discover about whether NPM delivered on its promise to shrink government?
The key findings were quite revealing, I have to say, and they truly challenged some very common, deeply held assumptions about how to achieve government efficiency. Here's the bombshell, really, and it fundamentally upends a core belief for many people. For outsourcing, the study found that government outsourcing did not reduce public sector size, not in terms of overall government expenditure, and not in terms of overall government employment.
Wow. So all that contracting out didn't actually shrink the state overall.
Not according to their analysis of this data set. In fact, and this is the truly counterintuitive part, they found a positive correlation between outsourcing and public expenditures.
Positive. You mean as governments outsource more, their overall public spending actually tended to increase?
That's what the correlation suggests for this group of countries over this time period. It strongly supports their alternative hypothesis, H1B, that outsourcing doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in public sector size and might even be associated with an increase in spending.
Wow. So the exact opposite of the intended effect, or at least the claimed effect.
Yeah.
That's a huge finding. Why? Why do you think that might be happening?
It goes against everything we often hear about the supposed benefits of outsourcing.
It absolutely does, and it raises some really critical questions. The study itself suggests several potential reasons why those widely touted cost savings from outsourcing might not actually materialize when you look at the aggregate national level.
Like what? What could be canceling out the savings?
Well, one major factor could be significant transaction costs. It takes a lot of time and resources to draft complex contracts, monitor the performance of private providers, and enforce the terms of the agreement. These costs often aren't fully accounted for when comparing in-house versus outsourced provision.
The hidden costs of managing the contract itself. Exactly. Then there are potential issues with contract management and enforcement. What happens if the provider doesn't deliver? Renegotiating or finding a new provider can be expensive and disruptive, and there's also the risk of what economists sometimes call holdup. Once a private company becomes the sole provider of a critical service, they might be tempted to increase their prices over time, knowing the government is now dependent on them.
So initial savings might evaporate later on.
Precisely. It really highlights that simply shifting a service from the public to the private sector doesn't automatically guarantee efficiency or cost reduction. It can introduce entirely new layers of complexity and costs that need to be carefully managed.
That's a truly powerful insight for anyone thinking about public sector efficiency or privatization. Okay, so outsourcing might not be the magic bullet for shrinking government that its proponents claimed. What about the other big NPM policy they looked at? Decentralization, moving decision-making and service delivery closer to the local level. Did that fare any better in terms of reducing the size of the state?
In contrast to outsourcing, administrative decentralization did show a more promising result in their analysis, but with some important nuances. They found that decentralization did lead to a smaller public sector, but specifically with regard to expenditure.
Okay, so decentralization was linked to lower government spending overall.
Yes, particularly when that decentralization was accompanied by greater subnational government autonomy. Remember that measure of financial independence.
Right, when local governments could raise more of their own money, not just rely on transfers.
Exactly. So if local governments had both the responsibility for spending and the means to raise their own revenues, then overall government expenditures tended to decrease relative to GDP. The theory here is that local governments that have to face their own taxpayers directly might be more fiscally disciplined.
Makes sense. Accountability is closer to home. But did decentralization also lead to fewer government jobs?
That's the key nuance. While decentralization was linked to lower spending, the study found that it did not lead to a statistically significant reduction in overall public sector employment.
So spending went down, but the number of government workers didn't necessarily follow. How does that work?
It could be that services were delivered more efficiently, requiring less money but the same number of people. Or perhaps decentralization shifted jobs from the central government to the local level, resulting in no net change in total public employment. The study doesn't definitively answer the why on that point, but the finding is clear. Lower expenditure, but not necessarily lower employment. So this partially supports their hypothesis, H2A, that decentralization can reduce public sector size, but specifically for expenditure, and only really when paired with that local fiscal autonomy.
Okay, this is fascinating. The implications for you, the listener, seem really crucial here. While the intention of many NPM-style reforms like outsourcing was often explicitly to shrink government, make it cheaper, make it smaller, the empirical data from Europe, at least according to this study, suggests it didn't necessarily achieve that goal, particularly for outsourcing on the expenditure front. Decentralization, however, shows maybe more promise for controlling spending if it's done with real local autonomy.
That's a great summary. It really highlights the significant gap that can exist between theoretical claims or political promises and the actual real-world measurable outcomes. It's a powerful reminder for all of us to always question what we're measuring and why, and critically, to look at the actual data, not just accept the conventional wisdom about what makes government more efficient.
Absolutely. Okay, given everything we've discussed now, the whole historical drive for reform, Clinton's comprehensive, culturally focused effort, Bush's disciplined, data-driven approach, and then these crucial, maybe sobering empirical findings on NPM itself, what critical lessons emerged from all this? If you were advising a new president today, or anyone interested in genuinely improving public administration, what are the key takeaways? It feels like we should try and distill decades of experience into some actionable advice.
That's precisely what the IBM Center report attempts to do in its final section, and I think it offers some really valuable insights. It distills this extensive experience comparing Clinton and Bush into 4 vital lessons. These offer solid administrative advice not just for any incoming president, but really for any large organization, public or private, that's seeking to implement large-scale, lasting change.
Okay, let's hear them. What's lesson number 1?
Lesson number 1 is put management issues on the front burner early. Don't treat them as an afterthought. This means starting on a very firm footing. They advise avoiding making rash campaign promises about management specifics that might inadvertently cripple your future policy-making ability.
Like Clinton's promise to cut White House staff.
Exactly. Candidate Bill Clinton promised to reduce the White House staff by 25%, and once elected, he felt compelled to follow through. But many argued it left his policymaking operation understaffed during his critical first term. So what you say during a campaign really matters and can have unforeseen consequences.
Be careful what you promise.
Right. It also means starting early. Successful reform efforts, as we saw with both NPR and PMA, typically begin within weeks, maybe months, of taking office. Why? Because implementation is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes years to see results, so you can't afford to wait. And maybe most critically under this first lesson, you absolutely must secure and maintain top-level support. The president's personal interest, their time, their commitment are paramount. There must be a dedicated champion for reform, someone senior, trusted, who reports directly to the president and is deeply engaged day to day. Think Vice President Gore for Clinton or Clay Johnson reporting to Bush. Without that unwavering commitment from the very top, reform efforts just tend to fade away when things get tough or attention shifts elsewhere.
Okay, so lesson 1 is prioritize it, start fast, and make sure the boss is fully committed. Makes sense. What's the second lesson?
The second lesson is to clearly define the scope of the effort in advance. Before you jump in, know what you're trying to achieve. This is about establishing what the military sometimes calls commander's intent, a clear set of overarching principles and values that will guide the entire reform effort.
What kind of choices need to be made about scope?
Well, you need to decide. Is the primary emphasis going to be on cutting costs, reducing waste, fraud, and abuse? Or is the main goal fundamentally improve performance and customer satisfaction? Is the focus going to be on overhauling government-wide governance systems like budgeting or HR? Or is it more about transforming frontline service delivery directly to citizens? Each of these implies very different strategies, involves different players, different stakeholders, different ways of measuring success.
So you can't just say reform government.
Yeah.
You need to be specific about what kind of reform.
Exactly. And the report argues this emphasis should ideally derive directly from the core values the president-elect brings to office. These guiding principles must then be effectively communicated throughout the government. We saw this contrast clearly. Clinton focused on messages like customers first, cut red tape, empower employees, while Bush prioritized efficiency and results. Without this clarity on the scope and the guiding principles right from the outset, a reform effort can very quickly lose focus. It gets pulled in too many directions by competing agendas and ends up achieving very little.
That's a crucial point. If you don't have a clear target, you definitely can't hit it. What about the actual process of developing the specific reform initiatives themselves? Once you know the scope, how do you decide what specific things to do?
That leads directly to the third lesson. Come to agreement on an initiative development and selection process. How are you actually going to generate the reform ideas? A critical initial decision here is whether to start with what's there or start over. New administrations often have this strong impulse to discard all previous efforts from the prior administration, wanting to put their own stamp on things.
The not invented here syndrome.
Exactly. But this frequently leads to unnecessary delays and a lot of duplicated work. The report gives an example. The Clinton administration initially discarded an existing agriculture department plan to streamline its field office structure, only to have the NPR team essentially redesign the exact same effort, delaying the results by about 3 years. Similarly, the Bush administration recreated Clinton's employee survey a year after taking office, only to find they needed largely the same questions and got largely the same results. Leveraging existing foundations where appropriate can provide a much quicker start.
So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Build on what works.
Right. You also need to decide upfront on the process itself. Are you going to use a more top-down, expert-driven process to develop initiatives, like Bush's PMA, or are you going to use a more bottom-up, open process that actively engages employees and customers, like Clinton's NPR did with its listening sessions and labs? Are you going to involve external stakeholders heavily, Congress, unions, think tanks? Or keep it mostly in-house? Are you going to use a formal commission or a more flexible internal task force? Clinton's NPR was certainly more inclusive in its development phase, while Bush's PMA was more top-down and expert-driven. Both approaches have distinct advantages and disadvantages, and this choice profoundly impacts who is involved, the kind of initiatives that emerge, and how they are ultimately implemented and accepted by the bureaucracy and stakeholders.
It's a huge consideration because it really shapes the entire journey of the reform effort. Who feels ownership? Who might resist?
Yeah.
Okay, finally, what's the fourth lesson? We've put it on the agenda early, defined the scope, Figured out how to develop the initiatives. What's next?
The fourth lesson, and you could argue it's the most important one, is to invest deeply in implementation and follow through. Developing the initiatives, writing the report, making the announcement, that's actually the easy part, relatively speaking. Actually getting something to change on the ground across the massive federal government, that's the real challenge. And it requires enormous long-term commitment and persistence.
Okay, so how do you ensure that follow-through actually happens?
The report offers several components to this. First, create a dedicated focal point for action. You need a small, dedicated core team whose primary job is driving implementation across agencies. This was the role of the NPR core staff for Clinton, or the OMB champions, assigned to each PMA initiative under Bush. Clay Johnson, as Bush's deputy director for management, was cited as a master at this, focusing relentlessly on setting clear expectations, creating clear measures of success, and ensuring single-person accountability for driving each specific initiative forward. Someone has to wake up every morning thinking about implementation.
So clear responsibility and focus.
Absolutely. Second, select agency executives who get it. The political appointees and career executives leading the departments and agencies must be personally committed to the change agenda and truly understand what's required to improve operating performance. They can't just pay lip service to it. The Bush administration, for example, was apparently very intentional about recruiting CEO-style managers, people with strong operational backgrounds, and giving them clear lines of responsibility for implementing the PMA within their agencies.
So it's about having the right people and the right structure, with clear marching orders. What else helps drive that action and ensure commitment over the long haul?
Third, develop a comprehensive roadmap for action. You need to clearly link the management improvements you're seeking directly to the agency's core mission and its operating performance. Show how better management leads to better results that people care about. Connecting reform efforts directly to the budget process, as Bush did so powerfully with the PART tool, is an incredibly effective way to gain serious attention and drive real change. While Clinton didn't tie reform to budgets in quite the same direct way, his administration did make a point of providing higher visibility for tangible successes, like those increased tornado warning times or faster drug approvals, showing the public the concrete benefits of reinvention.
Making it real for people, connecting it to the mission or the money.
Exactly. Fourth, obtain support from Congress, but be smart and realistic about how you do it. The lesson from both administrations seems to be avoid pushing for broad, standalone legislative packages focused only on management reform. They often fail due to political complexity or lack of interest. Instead, the more effective approach seems to be weaving specific management fixes and reforms into the traditional authorizing and appropriating processes for specific agencies or programs. Many of those NPR recommendations, for example, were successfully woven into over 90 different bills dealing with other subjects. Now, the downside of this effective approach is that it often reduces the public visibility of the reforms, as they're not contained in easily identifiable high-profile bills.
So be strategic and maybe a little stealthy with Congress.
Perhaps. Fifth, use the presidency strategically. The bully pulpit is a powerful tool for management reform, just like for policy. The president can effectively use symbols of power, like Bush making a point of addressing the entire senior executive service about the PMA, or Clinton making that famous appearance on the David Letterman show where he symbolically broke an ashtray to promote procurement reform and cutting government waste.
Right, using visibility to signal importance.
But the report cautions a careful balance needs to be struck. If management reforms are seen as overly partisan or as just an attack on federal employees, they risk failure and can alienate the career workforce whose cooperation you absolutely need. Bush's aggressive strategic sourcing initiative, for example, became seen by many as partisan, and Congress eventually stepped in to significantly limit its use. So, presidential leadership matters, but how it's wielded is crucial.
That's a really crucial point about the political balancing act required for any kind of lasting change, especially in government. What's the final piece of advice for sustaining action over time?
Sixth, you have to effectively coordinate and collaborate with the agencies. Management responsibility ultimately rests with the individual departments and agencies themselves, and increasingly with the vast networks of third parties, contractors, grantees, state and local governments that they rely on to deliver services. So using things like task forces and interagency councils like the PMC is absolutely crucial for gaining consensus, sharing best practices, and ensuring consistent follow-through across the complex web of government. You can't just dictate from the center.
Building coalitions for change within the government.
Right. And seventh, and finally, you need to develop a means to keep agencies and employees focused over the long haul. Persistence is absolutely key in large scale reform. It doesn't happen overnight. Using tools like periodic public reports, transparent scorecards, like NPR's annual progress reports or the PMA's quarterly public scorecards, and maybe even awards programs can help maintain engagement, sustain momentum, and provide ongoing accountability. Both administrations clearly understood that keeping the vast bureaucracy engaged and moving forward requires constant communication, clear tracking of progress, and visible recognition of both successes and shortcomings.
Wow. What a journey through the ambition, the incredibly diverse strategies, and yeah, the sometimes messy reality of government reform. From Clinton's really expansive reinvention to Bush's highly disciplined management agenda, and then bringing in that fascinating empirical look at new public management itself, we've really seen just how complex it is to drive lasting change in public administration. We've gone from the big picture historical context right down into the detailed implementation strategies and then zooms back out for a crucial empirical validation or maybe questioning of the actual impact of these kinds of reforms.
Indeed, it really underscores that while presidents often come into office with a clear mandate for change, maybe grand visions for reform, the enduring lesson seems to be that truly successful, lasting reform requires so much more than just that vision. It needs meticulous planning, unwavering top level commitment sustained over years, and a really keen, nuanced understanding of both the political realities and the complex organizational dynamics on the ground.
Yeah, it's not just about having the right idea.
Not at all. And those empirical findings from the Alonso, Clifton, and Díaz-Fuentes study, particularly regarding outsourcing and decentralization in Europe, they really raise an important question, don't they, about whether certain management fads or trends, despite their popularity or intuitive appeal, truly deliver on their stated promises of efficiency and reduced government size. It's a powerful reminder, I think, that good intentions and compelling theories don't always translate neatly into the expected or even the desired real-world outcomes. The data sometimes tells a different story.
It's such a powerful reminder that fixing the government, as Clinton put it, is less about finding quick fixes or silver bullets and much more about sustained, strategic, often difficult effort. It requires constantly adapting, learning from experience, and being willing to question assumptions. What truly stands out to me from this whole deep dive is how absolutely crucial it is to rigorously define what success even means in government reform, and then how incredibly challenging it can be to measure that success honestly, especially when the real-world results don't always neatly match the initial claims or the theoretical goals. It really pushes us to think much more critically beyond just the rhetoric.
Absolutely. And that leads directly, I think, to an important question for you, the listener, to ponder as you reflect on this deep dive we've taken today. In a world where the call for smaller government or more efficient public services seems absolutely constant, how can we ensure that our reform efforts, whatever they may be, are genuinely improving performance and outcomes for citizens? How do we make sure they aren't just satisfying political rhetoric or relying on unverified claims of cost savings that might not even materialize? What are the true, meaningful, measurable metrics we should really be paying attention to when we evaluate government reform efforts, especially when the empirical evidence, like we saw with outsourcing, might actually contradict widely held beliefs or convenient political promises?
That's a fantastic thought to leave everyone with. Definitely something to chew on as you think about how our public sector is managed and the immense challenges our leaders face in trying to improve it. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into public administration and reform. We really hope you feel a little more well-informed and perhaps even a little more curious about how things really work behind the scenes. We definitely encourage you to keep asking those big questions.